We are back. Easy for me to say. Another edition of Colts Corner with myself, Kevin Bowen. Mark Dykton out of the bullpen with us here. You guys have heard Mark on with us many times. Mark, as always, appreciate your voice.
No problem. Thank you for having me again.
I would say probably two of the more active teams so far. Your Bears certainly beefing up the trenches, and the Colts, shockingly, here a weekend of free agency, about as active as you could imagine. You know, honestly, in both ways of just the quantity of free agents that they have signed, and then also some of their in-house guys have actually moved on. About a handful of those guys have moved on. So a lot to get to on today's podcast. We'll go over, I think we'll actually probably start, Mark, with your ex-Bear, Khalil Herbert. We'll kind of make our way through the list and moves that have happened since. Before we move any further, I do want to add just kind of one more thing, because I think this news item kind of broke after we had recorded last week, and that was Charvarius Ward meeting the media. He also joined JMV, our afternoon show here on 107.5 The Fan. And Mark, I go back to some audio that we played in January after the Chris Ballard press conference of him pretty much saying, hey, we got to get the ball across the goal line in some of these deals. I got to identify free agents, and then we've got to finish. And Ward shared, I thought, a great story about how he thought he was going to New Orleans. New Orleans is the closest NFL team to his hometown. He felt like that's where he was going. And then he said at the last minute, the Colts ramped up the offer. And so, boom, now he's a member of the Indianapolis Colts. And this is a 180 from what we're used to with Chris Ballard. It's a vast, vast change from how they have largely operated. So whether you want to look at the backloading of some contracts, whether you want to look at the quantity of the free agents, whether you want to look at the nature of, again, boy, we're not going to just be stringent and stick to this price, and it's the only price we're going to have on this player. No. Sometimes the market becomes a bit of a bidding war. You've got to play that game if you want to dip your toes into that water. So I just think in a lot of different ways, Mark, the Colts have acted very, very differently than how we're used to.
Yeah, and the Ward signing, I've described him as a dog, a DAWG, something that the Colts don't really have and haven't had. But I like his attitude. I like his mentality. I think he's going to bring something to that secondary that's been sorely lacking the last few seasons. And I just think he'll bring something to that locker room as well, because we always talk about how the Colts kind of get caught up with the same captains year after year. They need some new voices in that locker room. He sure seems like he's going to be a new voice. He's going to be pretty vocal about it.
He's got corner swagger. There's no debating that. Again, 17 playoff games, as you mentioned last week. That really stands out to me. And we'll see how much they do the traveling around with him. You know, how much does he travel opposing wideouts? Their wideout schedule this year, obviously, you got Nico Collins twice. You got Puka Nacua. You face, Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. You face George Pickens and DK Metcalf. So I just think having that wrinkle, though, and a willingness to go to that if you feel it's necessary. I'm not saying you need to do it 17 games out of the year and 60 snaps a game, but at some critical junctures of games or certain weeks, I do think it's important to be willing and feel comfortable to have that at your disposal. So just a couple of lingering items from kind of the Ward Bynum. We'll actually hear from Cam Bynum a little bit later today as we're recording this on Monday morning, and the Daniel Jones signing. So, Mark, unless you got anything else to add, we probably should start with Khalil Herbert.
Yeah, let's go Khalil Herbert then.
Can I put you on the spot?
Sure.
He is a member of the Bears, or was a member of the Bears.
Mm-hmm.
You are used to watching a little bit of Khalil Herbert action. Colts fans should be bracing themselves for what?
I think it's a great signing. I've always liked Khalil Herbert. They tried to do the lead back situation with him. He's more of a shared backfield kind of guy, but he can catch the ball in the backfield. I think that is a dynamic that the Colts, again, have been sorely lacking, is having that pass-catching running back option, and he will certainly bring that. I think he's a great change of pace when it comes to giving Jonathan Taylor a rest on a play or two. So I think Colts fans will absolutely love Khalil Herbert. I like him a lot. They traded him in Cincinnati last season. I didn't really do much there, but nice to see him land with the Colts. I'm very intrigued to see what they do with him, because I think that opens the playbook a little bit more with Shane Steichen.
Yeah, frankly, I just thought the Colts needed to totally retool their running back depth. I just thought it was such an unreliable group once Jonathan Taylor went to the bench. And, I don't think we're here yet with Taylor, but, if you want to look at some of the deeper numbers of running back carries, he is starting to approach a bit of a scary number. I've always felt like Taylor is so pre-rehab base that I feel like he could be a bit of an outlier, a la Derrick Henry. But still, you don't want to ignore that. But more than that, if that happened here in 2025, you just need more reliable backups. And, Herbert's been an effective guy on passing downs, which, again, I think that's kind of the focus, too, behind him. Now, I still would like to see a day 3 pick at running back. I think that's what kind of that's what day 3 can be about there in the middle rounds. So I'd like to see that for them. But, again, you need some reliable insurance at running back, so this one makes a lot of sense to me.
Only 26 years old as well, same as Jonathan Taylor, so young backfield they got going.
Yeah,
but obviously Jonathan Taylor more miles than Khalil Herbert.
And again, I would add one in the draft.
For sure.
I think that kind of 3-man grouping makes some sense.
Yeah, I like it a lot. I like it a lot for their offense, and I like it a lot for Jonathan Taylor's too, because you can't keep going into the season just having him be the lead back. That's kind of the Colts are kind of doing a little old school where they have one lead back kind of taking the bulk of it, and Khalil Herbert will help share those carries, I think.
Was next on the list Neville Gallimore?
Spencer Schrader.
Okay, yeah, re-signing the kicker there. Boy, I didn't have kicker competition necessarily on the list, but, by all means. I got no issue with it. If you look at Schrader, kind of the weird thing was he didn't kick any long field goals, and Matt Gay missed all the long field goals. So Matt Gay was a perfect 61 of 61 inside of 50 yards last year. That includes, obviously, extra points. That's kind of wild. And then he was, 3 of 8, 3 of 9 last year, north of that. You would save a little bit with Matt Gay from a contract standpoint. Now, again, Schrader was perfect last year, 14 of 14. Didn't kick a ton, but still. But he didn't kick anything longer than 50. But I'm totally fine with this. I think this is something that makes some sense. Obviously, Schrader is a little bit younger. I don't act like Matt Gay is aging by any means. But again, you could save you a little bit of money. And, if you're going to be about competition and it's not going to hamstring you from other deals, throw some kicker competition at it.
And this is a 2-year deal, correct? This isn't
right.
Just...
I think that's what kind of caught some people. Like, oh, boy, this could be a little bit more here. Again, I think at times last year I was could kicker be a little bit of a practice squad, consistent presence there. I know Schrader ended up, where did he go? Jets and Chiefs, I want to say, were his other two stops last season here. So I think you don't make a kicking change until the misses under 50 start to happen. When you start to get into that was kind of Adam Vinatieri a handful of years ago of like, okay, yes, you would like for your NFL kicker to make it from longer than 50. That's obviously, I think, kind of a new NFL bar, but the egregious missing inside of 50, then that would, I think, lead to a little bit more of the, hey, should we cut this guy? But again, you've reached the back half of the Matt Gay contract, and the guarantees aren't, I don't know if he has any left, to be honest with you. So, little kicking competition. Now, probably never a good thing when you have quarterback competition and kicking competition.
Yeah, that's usually not
competition. No.
Smooth and steady. No. How does the 2-year deal work? Because I know that this has been kind of a topic I've seen in my mentions on social media as well. People are like, well, is that like remove him from the practice squad? Is he going to be on the active 53, or how's that going to work? I don't believe that's going to be the case.
Yeah, I want to say right now, I would assume the cap hit is minuscule. I'd have to double check this. And like the signing bonus would be very small as well. And it's not like if you carried him on the 50, or if you cut him, you would have some large dead cap hit by any means. Where I think the Matt Gay one's a little bit different from a post-June signing versus a pre-June signing here. So I need to look into that Schrader contract a little bit more. But I think if he doesn't make the team, then yes, he could still obviously be a practice squad candidate. It's not like really any teams carry 2 kickers on their 53-man roster. If you just compare,
if anybody could, the Colts could.
Well, yeah, exactly. Hang a banner for that. If you compared his contract side by side to Matt Gay, though definitely cheaper, but I'll be interested to see how Gay bounces back.
One of my favorite things of the Colts last season, and there was few and far between, but it was the Jim Irsay, we have signed and or cut Spencer Schrader. It was like just a revolving door of just.
Yeah, it was the old PJ Walker, right?
Here you go. See you later. Here you go. Come back. Just leave the seat open for you.
Who we got up next?
That is Gallimore.
Okay, so Neville Gallimore here. I actually remember when he was being recruited by Oklahoma, Canadian guy. So I think that's what caught a lot of people, or had some interest there. I look at him as like think a little bit more Raekwon Davis versus Dayo Odeyingbo when you're trying to like look at departures from the D-line. Bit more of a space eater. Really not a lot of production in his NFL career. Honestly, his best moments probably were in last year's 2 playoff games with the Rams. He really had a couple of strong games with them. But, Dallas drafted him in the 3rd round. He moved on to Miami last year. The Dolphins cut him. And then, with his future up in the air, actually joined the Rams. And again, carved out a pretty nice role for them as a rotational defensive tackle. So I think we mentioned this a little bit earlier in the offseason. Lou Anarumo loves big dudes. And this is kind of that. So, again, 1-year deal, rotate in, nothing earth-shattering from an expectation standpoint. But the depth at defensive tackle, a la the depth at running back, I thought got super unreliable once you went to the bench there. So, important to try and, I think, change that up. I still think as we sit here on Monday morning, Mark, I still think defensive line could use another body.
I agree.
Probably a little bit more in the Dayo Odeyingbo, like interior pass rush option. Probably more of an edge guy though than anything. Latu, I believe, is your only edge rusher under contract after next season. We know Samson Ebekom's coming off the torn Achilles, so I think that would be wise to look into.
You see that coming from free agency, or is that a draft situation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I hate to like force needs in the draft. I honestly could get behind because I think it's a decent trench depth draft. I could probably get behind even kind of like a middle round, D lineman, and then, maybe another in free agency. I'd probably lean a little bit more towards free agency. I think with Latu last year we saw it. I mean, Latu was an extremely accomplished rusher. A lot of people are like Shamar Stewart from Texas A&M. He kind of falls in some of those old Penn State edge rushers of like not a lot of production in college. Okay, well, that mean it's going to take a little bit of time in the NFL. Again, Latu, we felt like he was as decorated as they come, and it might take a little bit of time with him. So I think when you factor that in, I think it's important to kind of look a little bit in the veteran route. Again, I understood why Dayo was gone, but that is the most saps of any defensive lineman from last season. So trying to replace him is something that I don't think is just an obvious answer.
No, and if you're looking for a free agent defensive lineman or edge rusher of some sort, this is usually when Chris Ballard makes hay, the second wave of free agency, right?
Sure. And, he really, I think, started this last week. I guess we'll get to Corey Ballantyne now. He's the final outside of the building free agent. I think special teams with him, certainly, his corner background is not super extensive, a little bit with Green Bay 2 years ago. Jerome Henderson, one of the new Colts DB coaches, he does have some history with them in New York, but I kind of look at Ballantyne as like gunner / kick returner. Again, ton of special team snaps in his career. His body is honestly probably a little bit more in the nickel mold, so maybe some depth. Potentially, 5'11" is definitely not what the Colts typically have there. So certainly your big corner signing is Javarius Ward. This is a little bit more special teams based here from Ballantyne. 6th round pick in 2019, Corey Ballantyne.
Nothing wrong with that. You want to move on to Grant Stewart and Kylan Granson talk?
These are our last 2 in-house guys, Mark. And again, the in-house guys have moved on. Now, we played some Grant Stewart audio on our airwaves on Monday morning. This is a dude that just screams a Detroit Lion special teamer.
He looks the part. He sounds the part. He seems like Dan Campbell's going to headbutt him at some point,
1000%.
but for fun.
But they'll both be bleeding. They'll both be laughing.
And they'll be laughing.
How much does Lou Anarumo want to change up linebacker? I think that is a question that I would have. EJ Speed, of course, still a free agent as we sit here a week into it. Stewart did start 5 games for you at linebacker last year after really not playing at all on defense those first 2 years. So, special teams-wise, you're losing some snaps. And, just more than anything, I just thought, for those that missed it, I think we played on the podcast. Stewart, just an incredible story. Sadly, there's some tragedy involved in it, but it's pretty damn remarkable. He's now going, into his 3rd team. He's signing a new contract with another team, all of that. So I am interested. How much was this a little bit more? Anarumo looks at the linebackers and says, well, yeah, high energy guy, great special teamer, but I would like this as I'm filling out my linebacker room. Is probably one of the more up in the air rooms right now.
Mm-hmm.
Franklin's the obvious one, but then after that, I guess it's Jalen Carlisle. We'll see if they continue to draft there because Chris Bauer's done that a whole lot. But Grant Stewart to the Lions.
I do find it really interesting that there are some like major positions on this Colts roster as it stands now that could have first-time starters in what is considered a pretty critical year, I would say, for the team. Like, you've got probably 2 of the 5 offensive linemen in front of Anthony Richardson, which is we all assume he's in a make-or-break year 3. And then you've got the linebacker crew, which is kind of like Lou Anarumo is trying to get his fingerprints all over that. How much first-time starters are going to come out of that as well with Zaire Franklin? It's going to be pretty interesting, I feel like, because the pressure is kind of on this team, and they're putting a lot of faith and hope into, I think, a lot of first-time starters.
And, Mark, I said this to you on our show on Monday morning. Linebacker kind of underwhelmed me last year.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much we spent on that, but as I sit here right now, and again, I mean, it's March 17th. We give these podcasts as the calendar moves along. I kind of look at linebacker and think it needs some more. Zaire Franklin isn't getting any younger. It needs some more. So how that position group plays out remains to be seen.
The tight end group was my most disappointing on offense, and linebacker was my most disappointing group on the defensive side last season.
Speaking of tight end, let's round it out with Granson. Again, off to the Eagles there. Second worst catch percentage of any qualifying tight end last season. Just super unreliable. And I get that, not all of it maybe is at him, but, even Allie Cox and Ogletree and I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody, probably Mallory. Those guys didn't have as inefficient as seasons as he did. So he did play a decent amount. We're talking north of 40% of the snaps each of the last 3 years. So the tight end, to Mark's point, was always a need. It certainly still is, but replacing that, now it's an actual like, oh, wow, he's now gone. Here's 400 snaps or whatever he ended up playing that you have to replace. So, Mark, as we sit here on March 17th now, a week into things, 7 new guys. That would be Cam Bynum at safety, Javarius Ward at corner, Corey Ballantyne at corner, Neville Gallimore at defensive tackle. Moving over to offense, Daniel Jones at quarterback, Khalil Herbert running back, and, of course, Spencer Schrader, the kicker. 3 guys retained, Ashton Doolin, and then 2 interior offensive line. Depth options there, and Wesley French and Danny Pinter. Both those make sense to me. As you lose Ryan Kelly and Will Fries, again, I view them as kind of depth, competing for 53-man roster spots. And then gone, of course, Kelly Fries. We talked about Stewart and Granson. And then a Dangbo to your Bears. That leaves Mo Alley Cox, EJ Speed, Julian Blackman, Joe Flacco, Sam Ellinger. That's probably where the list stops for interesting in-house free agents still in the open market.
Think EJ Speed still finds his way back to Indy, or is he going to find work elsewhere? We just mentioned that group.
Right. It's a good question. Speed's kind of he's a complex one for me. It's like, is he a special teamer or is he more than that? Mm-hmm. And he's about to be 30.
Yeah.
He's one of the rare kind of older draft picks they have signed here. So, yeah, I could see that happening. But I also could view it of like, well, what borderline led the team in missed tackles, and he needs to go elsewhere. So
yeah, I would say if you're turning 30 and you still don't really know what you are, maybe you already know what you actually are. Mm-hmm. So yeah. Mm-hmm. So it'll be interesting to see if their offseason acquisitions change their draft philosophy at all. There's certainly plenty of holes still on this roster despite the additions.
Yeah, and right now they still have room. I mean, they've kind of shifted things to like more of the singles here from a free agency standpoint, to use a baseball analogy. They could go a little double, triple action if they'd like, but part of me thinks it's a little singly. I'd like to see interior offensive line, again, get another body there, and then, like I mentioned, D-line a little bit earlier.
You ready to move to questions?
Let's do them.
All right, Josh/Jimmy, easy for me. So he says, love the show. A lot has been said of recent, though, multiple media platforms on Anthony Richardson and his off-field management in terms of showing up late to meetings / going to treatment late. There just seems to be a lot of negative rhetoric in regards to what him from platforms from like the Pat McAfee show insinuating, quote, if the Colts fans knew more, they might want Daniel Jones to win the job, etc. Do you know if there are any truth to this, or have you heard anything from inside the building on where Richardson is at? Thanks.
Yeah, I got, obviously several of these, and I guess let's just go back to what happened last year. You don't bench your franchise quarterback just out of the blue for no reason, or for, maybe not as, you don't change your tune 180 wise on him out of the blue with a benching like that without some substantial reasons why. So, I don't want to speak for McAfee. I've seen a couple of clips. I know it's been a little bit coy, if you will. I think the tap out really bothered a lot of people. And some just, don't want to get over that aspect of it, but I don't act like it's just a tap out with Richardson either. I think it's really difficult when you get to the NFL. Yeah, and the NFL is different, Mark. You have spent 3 years in college.
Mm-hmm.
The NBA is, you can come right after that first year. Teaching someone how to be a pro. Like, how much of that is an NFL obligation? Especially the quarterback position. I just think there's a lots of gray area. And I think you heard that even from the Colts vets. On and off the record, you'll hear Colts vets that didn't want Richardson benched, but also were really unhappy with how he was handling things Monday through Saturday. So what is it?
I know.
It's like this awkward...
It's a delicate dance that they don't seem to have figured out with him.
Right. It just is... it's very, very difficult. And, how a player is acting in January, February, and March, you're in the awkward period of you don't see the guy. I mean, they're not starting their offseason program for another month. He's on flights down to Florida and, spending a lot of his training down there. So, a point blank, all of this is going to come down to, certainly what happens when the offseason program rolls around, and most importantly, what happens when training camp and the season gets here. And I think that's what also makes this difficult. Mark, a big topic that we've had on our show is like, how do you properly split these quarterback reps?
Mm-hmm.
They both need them.
Yep.
This isn't Joe Flacco of last year. Joe Flacco could fall out of bed and you knew what Joe Flacco was going to be. Like, Joe Flacco is peanut butter and jelly. Daniel Jones, Anthony Richardson you're in the cookbook trying to make something crazy happen. You don't even know if you have all the ingredients for it.
I've got macaroni and cheese. I've got mayonnaise. What
was
can I
that
do
a good
here?
analogy or
I don't know.
Gosh, I don't know. It just popped in my head, and I thought I'd say it, and then I said it, and I was like, I hope Mark agrees.
It was good enough.
You kind of looked at me cross-eyed, and I'm like, oh, shit.
I would say if you're spending $14 million on a backup, and your quarterback who you spent a 4th overall pick on is still on his rookie deal, you got a lot of questions in that quarterback room, I would say.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people made a lot of the $14 million, and I get it.
That's the going rate, though, for a backup these days.
Two things. A, it's kind of the going rate, and I think we forget that, 5 years ago the salary cap was versus 5 years later. It's hard to kind of compare that. And then two, if I'm Daniel Jones's camp, I'm saying to the Colts, hey, even if Richardson looks great, that dude's not going to be healthy for 17.
Nope.
So you need my client for at least 4 games. Pay him like that.
Yeah.
I think that's a little bit of the thought process. I'll just add one more on this front because, and you and I were laughing about this a little bit. It's like, oh my gosh, this just sums up the Colts situation. You're telling me that if Daniel Jones won the starting job, this is the same guy that Zaire Franklin said that he wanted to play him and his team last year on the podcast?
That's where we're at.
Remember that?
Yep.
You're asking Richardson to do something hardly anyone's ever done in their NFL career, have the completion percentage that he's had for the first 2 years, and then boom. You're also asking Daniel Jones to do something quarterbacks don't do. He has started 70 games in his NFL career. People want to be done with Richardson, Mark, and he started 15 of them.
I know.
Can you imagine watching Richardson for 55 more starts?
Oh, God. I don't know if Colts fans could handle that.
So that is what you're like. This is not Norm Van Brocklin or insert your random quarterback that started 70 games and then all of a sudden, Warren Moon, and then all of a sudden struck gold. Like, in both of these cases, whether Jones all of a sudden, you say a resurrection, I don't know what you would call it. Richardson finds lightning in a bottle with his accuracy and his, Monday through Saturday quarterback standard. Both of them are long shots.
Yeah. And
yet you're hoping one pans out. So I bring all that up to say, well, then how do you handle the reps? It's almost like you need to get to May 1 and you need to say full-on commitment right here.
That's
one
why
or the other, all chips in, boom. Here you go. Here are the reps. We'll sink or swim with you. Because if you start to split these, Mark Dykton gets a day, Kevin Bowen gets a day, and that's what we're going to do. We're both going to be just as mediocre as we are right now.
Yeah, you're going to be charting things like, well, I guess he was 16 of 22, and this guy, it's one of those things where it's like, I think the whole idea of a quarterback competition, I'm going to be a little, I'm not going to believe it because I feel like they've invested so much in Anthony Richardson, and you've got Daniel Jones coming in on a 1-year deal. So aren't you going to like sink or swim with Richardson to start out at the very least? You're going to give him every opportunity,
I would assume.
unless it is so obvious that he is so much worse than Daniel Jones, where you can't hide it in training camp or the preseason games. I feel like he is going to be your starter, and then, break glass in case of emergency is when Daniel Jones steps in. If Anthony Richardson clearly isn't improving, if he's getting worse somehow, that's when Daniel Jones steps in. But this whole thought of that a quarterback competition is going to take place in training camp, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit jaded in that I don't think that's actually going to take place. I think they're going to give him every opportunity to start. Even if he doesn't look great, they're going to say, we've already invested so much time and effort into this kid. We have to see what we can do. And Daniel Jones can, if he has a great season, can up and leave us in 12 months.
I'm nodding my head at all of that. And that's reality. We're about to be here in a month and a half when things get underway.
And I still don't think that's the end of Anthony Richardson, even if he stinks it up this next season, because you can still have him. You can decline his fifth-year option and keep him around for a fourth year. I know that sounds like hell for Colts fans, but that is a realistic possibility.
One thing I can't get around with Richardson, and again, we probably still need to do like a full Richardson-centric pod. At this point, we'll probably expand on
a 2-hour-long podcast.
I know. He's 8-7 as a starting quarterback.
I know.
And I get that quarterback record is a heavy debatable topic. But he's 8-7 as a starting quarterback, and Mark, you fired the defensive coordinator that he has been 8-7 with as a quarterback. So, do we not pay enough attention to the running element that he brings, and that threat? How are you because people talk about him like he's 2-13 as a starting quarterback. I'm like, he's 8-7. So if he just made incremental, if we said he's 50% and now he's 56%. And if your defense, instead of being 24th, they were 18th, does 8-7 now become 11-5?
It's a great question. It's a great question. I don't know. I feel like even incremental improvements are not going to be enough for him to, for the Colts to consider fifth-year option and long-term extension. It's going to have to be, he has to make leaps and bounds above where he's been, whether it's completion percentage or just accuracy. There is so much he has to put into this year 3 to just change a lot of people's minds. And I don't know if anybody can do it, let alone a guy who's been in the bottom of the barrel as far as statistics. Yeah. You're in the company of Spencer Rattler and Cooper Rush and all that. That's not where your 4th overall pick should be.
Yeah. No. Great point.
Moving on to Jamie. We'll save the 2-hour Anthony Richardson podcast for another day.
For alcohol.
Yeah, it is St. Patrick's Day. Is Matt Gonzalez the heir apparent to Braden Smith? And if so, draft interior offensive lineman to the right guard next year as Gonzalez moves to right tackle next year and presumably plays right guard. Oh, man, this is a run-on sentence. Or Gonzalez is the right guard of the future and draft offensive tackle this year.
Yeah, again, right guard to me is still one mark that needs to be solved. I look at Gonzalez as the right tackle of the future. Braden Smith, a free agent next year. Again, Ballard loves the middle of the draft for this offensive line class, so do we see that there? Maybe Gonzalez for 1 year, I guess, wouldn't be the end of the world there, but I still view Matt Gonzalez as the right tackle of the future. And how you get there at right guard, I guess, is going to be a little bit more up in the air. I know Ballard had that throwaway line at the combine mark of Bordolini looked good at guard. It's well, I assume he's still going to be the center, right? And then Pinter at guard, I feel like has been different than Pinter at center. So, they could really use a Chris Reed from a few years ago in free agency, or Kevin Zeitler. Some people told me that maybe they were looking at him, but I think that type of signing, I saw Mekhi Becton went to the Chargers. Could that have helped out the Colts' depth a little bit? That sort of signing, I think, would make some sense here.
Yeah, I feel like just offensive line is going to be another question mark we have all season. Like I said, 2 of the 5 starters are likely going to be brand new, maybe more than that. We'll see. But it's going to be interesting. Like I said, a make or break year for Anthony Richardson, and you're going to have 2 of 5 new offensive linemen starting for you. That's going to be interesting as well.
Yeah, in depth, just in general, that question remains to be seen.
All right, Cole said, I'd love to see Trey Hendrickson as much as the next guy in a Colts uniform, but do you think spending assets on a trade and a large amount of the cap space on him would stretch the team too thin at a lot of other positions? In my eyes, they still need to address linebacker depth. They have to improve at the linebacker position from last year, and they can't run it back with the same unit, can they?
Kind of goes back to what we were saying about 10 minutes ago.
Yeah.
Linebacker sneaky for me. I'm just not sold, and depth too. I felt like that group was very underwhelming last year. By all accounts, it seems like Cincinnati's going to try to make this Trey Hendrickson thing work. Like I was saying earlier, Latu is your only edge under contract after this year. So, yeah, I mean, what you do at D end, I think remains, to go back to the baseball analogy, if there's one more kind of double or triple, I think that is how that remains a bit of an unknown. I will say this in regards to Richardson, and maybe something will change, Mark, because I want to be clear. It's March 17th. We'll see what happens at the 14th overall pick and things like that. It is wild. This has been a change. This week of free agency has undoubtedly been a change for Chris Ballard. But it is wild how little they've done with Anthony Richardson on the rookie contract.
Incredibly little.
I mean, you look at what your Bears have done. You look at what Houston's done. You look at what Washington has done. You can look at past examples, and I've brought them up 1,000 times on this podcast. But, offensively especially, obviously defensively you're feeling that attention in the defensive secondary right now. But how little they've done is, I guess it's not totally surprising, but I do remember, asking Chris specifically about, hey, what are the benefits of having a rookie contract quarterback? And, he mentioned the flexibility at the time. And, you really have gone through 3 off seasons because you knew, in 2023 you're drafting the quarterback. You've gone 3 off seasons. And when you compare them to other rookie contract quarterbacks, you've operated in 3 years in much, much more of a quieter manner than most teams would.
Well, and this goes back to something I said when free agency was getting started and all that, and when the whole Trey Hendrickson stuff was going on. It was like, the Colts should be in on this guy. Like, how come it's always, well, the Colts can't be on it, they have to pay a guard, or they have to do this and that. But yet you have teams like the Chiefs and the Eagles that can just find ways to manipulate the cap. Yet they have guys like Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce and Jalen Hurts and A.J. Brown and Saquon Barkley. They have all this talent and all this money, and yet they can find ways to manipulate the cap and move stuff around and make it just work. Right. And yet the Colts is just, for Colts fans, we're kind of just like, they can't do it. They've got to do others. I don't buy it. There are ways to make it work, and it's what either you're lazy and you don't want to try to make it work, or you're just incompetent and you can't figure it out. Because other teams that are in contentions make it work all the time, and yet the Colts are like, no, we can't do it.
And why is this week changed? Or this week, but this year, like
right.
What has all of a sudden changed? Is it just more embarrassment? And again, outside of 3 teams in the NFL, you've got the longest playoff drought in the league. Like, explain that to me.
Yeah.
Is that simply what it is? Because besides that, I think it's a very good point.
And it's like you said, Field Yates, I think we had on, and he said, the Colts have wasted Anthony Richardson's rookie contract. And that's absolutely true, because you look at, like you said, how Caleb Williams is being handled in Chicago, how C.J. Stroud is being handled in Houston. They are putting resources and money and spending big when they need to, because they know that once that rookie contract goes away for the quarterback, they're going to be paying hand over fist to pay these guys. So you might as well go into win now as much as you can. And now you're entering year 3 with Anthony Richardson, and there's just more questions than answers. And it's just like, at this point, you have kind of wasted it, because now you're not going to invest in a Trey Hendrickson and all that stuff, because you're going to have to put more resources in figuring out who your next quarterback is going to be if Anthony Richardson is not the answer, which I don't think he is.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really well said.
It stinks. I'll say that. It stinks.
That's kind of the reality of the situation you're in.
Let's round it out with Matt. He said, I'm happy with the moves, but it feels a little bit bittersweet. Yes, these players are relatively young, but the approach still feels a little win-now-ish. Until the Colts figure out the quarterback situation, they're just not going anywhere. I get the sense that the fan base believes Steichen and Ballard are tied to Richardson, but if they find an alternative and make the playoffs, no one will care much about missing with Richardson. Just like the 49ers with Brock Purdy, call me crazy, but if I'm Ballard, I'd seriously consider using a high pick on a quarterback. What are your thoughts?
Well, I guess let me start here. You can't ignore defense totally. Like, you've been bad over there. Again, I mean, you fired your defensive coordinator, and I think free agency is the time to kind of try and get right over there. Now, in regards to quarterback, one more year, why does this regime, necessarily deserve another chance at quarterback? I'd point to that, but right now, Mark, the only quarterbacks on the roster are Daniel Jones, Jason Bean, and Richardson. Where's that 4th quarterback come from? I'm not ruling out the draft either. So, how they handle that remains to be seen. And I think I've said in this podcast, my tune has largely changed. I would draft a quarterback every year, just stylistically how that position is handled, especially with Richardson. But, Daniel Jones, I mean, let's talk in crazy land here. Daniel Jones looks like Dan Marino next season. Well, that means he's a free agent.
Mm-hmm.
He could sign anywhere.
Yeah.
So, that's not a guarantee. You would assume he would be back with you, but that's not a guarantee either. Mark Dykton, you got anything else?
No, that's it. Just, I like what Chris Ballard has done. The offseason does feel different, but there's still a lot of questions, a lot of key positions that we probably won't have answers to until the summer.
March Madness, who are you picking?
Oh, boy. You're asking me. I had my daughters fill out brackets, and I haven't filled out mine yet. I was leaning Duke, but the Cooper Flagg injury happened, so do I want to ride with Duke the whole way? I know that's a bit chalk, but I think the Blue Devils might get it this year.
I feel like I'm cleaning up one of my kids' poops, and I'm going to take Houston.
Okay.
Nothing
You really swallowing that Calvin Sampson train, right?
Says me and Kelvin Sampson like that. That's what I feel like here.
Notre Dame basketball is beating you down.
Disgusting. I just said that out loud. He's Mark Dykton. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Colts Corner signing off.